Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining the second in our series of live webinars from Pool Re Solutions. My name is Ed Butler. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer at Pool Re, and I'll be your chair for this session. For those who are not aware, Pool Re Solutions is the exciting new business division recently launched within Pool Re, the government-backed terrorism reinsurer. For those not familiar with Pool Re, we were established in 1993 as the insurance industry's mutual for insuring terrorism risk within Great Britain. This was in response to the untenable losses and uncertainty caused by the Provisional IRA's devastating bombings in the City of London and Manchester. Pool Re exists to correct market failure, protect the UK economy, and safeguard society and livelihoods from acts of terrorism. We offer a financial safety net of around 2.2 trillion of assets and businesses of all sizes. And we have a sizable reserve fund of 10 billion pounds sterling, which has been built up over the last 27 years, investing insurers' premium contributions in preparation for the unthinkable. For our second webinar, where terrorism and cyber worlds collide, we're very privileged to have Stewart and Conrad, two experts in cybersecurity and terrorism matters. Eden and Conrad are going to share their thoughts and experience of the growing threat posed by extreme right-wing terrorist organisations and the rising tide of terrorist activity online and in the dark web. Both will provide some ideas on how businesses might mitigate these threats, both specifically and broader. To introduce them, I'd just like to say a few words on today's format. I'll ask Conrad and Eden to speak for no more than 5 minutes before moving on to Q&A. We see this very much as an interactive session, and so please do start sending me your questions once Eden and Conrad have finished their headline points. The webinar will finish at 11:45 sharp. We will be recording this webinar and we'll be publishing it on our website for you to view later. To start us off, we're delighted to have Eden Stewart join the panel. Eden is the senior analyst within Pool Re's risk awareness team, having joined the company in 2017. Eden leads the team's research efforts into right-wing extremism and has written extensively on the subject. Prior to joining Pool Re, Eden worked as a cyber threat intelligence analyst. He holds a master's degree in intelligence and security from Brunel University. Eden, a very warm welcome to you.
Thanks, Ed. So there are really three issues I want to talk about this morning. The first is about uncertainties around the scale of the threat posed by right-wing terrorism. Secondly, I want to talk about how the tactics of right-wing terrorists appear to be shifting. And finally, the role of the internet in effectively shaping the new generation of right-wing extremists. So how great a threat is right-wing terrorism? Last September, the head of UK CT policing, Neil Sood, described it as the fastest growing terror threat in the country. A month ago, the German Interior Minister said that the biggest threat to security in Germany was right-wing extremism. While in the States, it's become conventional wisdom in some circles, the far right are now the biggest terror threat in the United States too. So is there the evidence to sustain these assertions? Looking at the statistics, as so often, it's a pretty mixed picture. In Britain, there have been 3 confirmed attacks by right-wing extremists since 2015, with at least a further 7 plots foiled. By my rough estimation, these figures represent more than double that of the preceding 5-year period, definitely suggesting an intensification of the threat. I'm a little more circumspect about other metrics, like conviction figures or figures for referrals to prevent the government's counter-radicalisation scheme. While we've seen a big increase in prosecutions and convictions related to right-wing terrorism, many of these are for convictions for membership of previously unprescribed organisations and therefore don't directly translate into sort of a representation of the threat, while prevent figures are equally complicated for a variety of reasons. Outside the UK, we've seen a spate of pretty nasty attacks across Europe and North America in the last 18 to 24 months. Many of these followed the Christchurch shootings in March 2019 in New Zealand. However, whether these represent an increase in the frequency of right-wing terrorist activity is still up for dispute. Firstly, there are disagreements over what actually constitutes right-wing terrorism. Should, for example, anti-abortion related violence in the United States be considered right-wing terrorism? That remains a controversial point. Furthermore, even where violence is pretty clearly motivated by right-wing ideologies, there's often a high degree of ambiguity as to whether these acts are actually terrorism or should be treated as hate crimes. So the taxonomical challenges means there are significantly different figures for the frequency of far-right terrorism. I've looked at data from the University of Maryland, which produces the Global Terrorism Database, the University of Oslo, the Center for Strategic International Studies, all have their own databases which come to considerably different conclusions based on different inclusion criteria. So while most sources...
Eden, can you speak close to the microphone and maybe face it? That's what we're getting a bit in and out.
Oh, is that better? Can you hear me? So while most sources point to an increase in the frequency of violence, this is by no means a uniform view. However, what does appear to be pretty clear is that the lethality of attacks by right-wing extremists has increased in recent years. So going back 20 or 30 years, there were occasionally attacks by right-wing extremists which were intended to be or were highly lethal. So I'm thinking of sort of the David Copeland bombings in London in 1999, Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma in 1995. However, these were pretty rare events, and most far-right violence was manifested in sort of so-called street violence, attacks against property, whether arson or vandalism, or unarmed assaults. Now, this kind of activity is still fairly commonplace, but there has been a discernible increase in the volume of mass casualty attacks committed by right-wing extremists. This has been particularly pronounced since the Christchurch attack last March, with at least further 7 attacks demonstrating similar MO in the US and Europe. So this suggests a new dynamic is at play. I think the emergence of this new modus operandi has been driven by 2 principal factors. The first is the emulation of tactics used by Islamist extremists, particularly that of marauding firearms. I think this is, on the one hand, a function of Islamist terrorism effectively setting the tone for terrorism at large, leading their tactics being emulated by other threat actors. But it also represents a deliberate escalation by right-wing extremists in response to attacks by Islamist extremists. This process known as reciprocal radicalization. I think the other major driver of this new dynamic is the emergence of, I suppose, an online far-right subculture, which is often the intended audiences of attacks. We've seen this very explicitly with the live streaming of recent attacks in Germany, New Zealand, elsewhere. And this live streaming, I think, is an attempt to galvanize action by others, the propaganda of the deed, but it also reflects the fundamentally performative nature of these attacks. In the same way that Islamist extremists seek to be immortalized through martyrdom, right-wing extremists seek the approbation of those who they wish to share, who they share these online communities with. Indeed, they too wish to be sort of immortalized amongst their sort of co-ideologues. Now, these communities, to a large degree, define the new far right. They're basically an amalgam of sort of online troll culture and far right conspiracy theories. Perhaps ironically, this new generation of right-wing extremists are far less parochial than their forebears. And these online spaces allow for the exchange of ideas across borders and the development of a distinct international subculture with its own language, references, in-jokes, etc. Now, while offline networking and recruitment still does very much occur, I think this online space is now one of the main drivers of right-wing radicalization. Unfortunately, it's difficult to combat. The internet is a notoriously hard place to police. So when 8chan, a prominent forum used by the far right, was taken offline in the wake of the Christchurch attack, its user base migrated either to other encrypted messenger apps or indeed to non-Western hosted social media platforms with perhaps laxer attitudes towards posting extremist content. The reality is that the internet is pretty hard to police, so I think it's unlikely that we'll see an effective response to this problem in the short term. I think on that cheery note, I shall hand over to Conrad, who I'm sure can elaborate more.
Great, thanks so much for that, Eden. We'll try and sort out your communications. You need to be speaking right over the microphone. Every time you turn it drops out. Apologies for everyone for that, but Conrad, I know, will be very clear and articulate in his response to Eden. Conrad's going to talk about the increasing use of the cyber domain by terrorists and other actors. Conrad is a distinguished fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and a senior advisor on cyber to companies such as BAE Systems, Nationwide Building Society, and Poole Re. He was the UK government's first cyber security ambassador, and before that spent 25 years at GCHQ. For the last 7 of these, he was the deputy head of the agency and led its intelligence and cyber operations. Welcome, Conrad.
Great, thank you very much, Ed, and it's great to be here. So as Eden said, terrorists live on the web, they live on the internet, they have done for many years, whether they're extreme right or on the Islamist side, or indeed of any other type. We know that terrorists use the internet extensively for propaganda. I mean, and Eden touched on some of the recent examples of live streaming attacks. But for all kinds of other propaganda purposes. They use it to communicate, finding different ways of communicating in encrypted means, in ways that the Western agencies find hard to track. They use it for command and control of their operations. They use it as a means of carrying out recruitment and generally, maintaining and advancing their operations. And they've done that for at least 20 years. And, it shouldn't be surprising. Often members of these groups, they're young, they're IT literate, they live on the web in their day-to-day lives, so why wouldn't they do so in their lives, their terrorist lives, if you like. But I think so far, there is no strong evidence of terrorists seeking to use cyber for seriously destructive attacks, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We have seen examples of terrorist groups using cyber for what we might call vandalism. So, vandalizing websites, things like that, fairly low level stuff. And there are some quite interesting examples of terrorists using cyber in slightly more sophisticated ways for espionage, which I'll talk about in a minute. But destructive attack is not something we've seen yet. I think when we talk about destructive attack, it's important to differentiate about the kind of things we're talking about. So at one end of the spectrum, you have the sort of what we might call the Hollywood end of destructive cyber attack, the things you see in movies, the let's take down the banking network or something like that. Now, these operations are incredibly hard, would be incredibly hard to do in the real world, even for the most advanced nation state cyber actor. So it's probably not surprising that we've not seen terrorist groups attempting this kind of thing. They simply don't have the skills, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the capability to launch those sorts of very sophisticated attacks. But at the bottom end of the spectrum, there's an interesting question, I think, about why, for example, we haven't yet seen terrorists launching ransomware attacks. So we all know about ransomware, it encrypts the data on our computers. Cyber criminals use it extensively. There's evidence of an uptick in ransomware during the current pandemic. And it can have widespread significant impact, as we saw from the WannaCry attack of 2017, which affected the NHS, amongst many others. So there's an interesting question about why terrorists haven't sought to go down that path. Will they in the future? What are the triggers that might lead them to do that? And it's possible that primarily they are just still attracted to the sort of visceral impact you get from a simple kinetic attack. And there's something about cyber that doesn't give that sort of impact they're looking for. But there are some interesting examples of certain terrorist groups doing more sophisticated things in the world of cyber. And I think it's particularly interesting to talk about Hamas. So Hamas now have got quite a strong track record in using cyber for intelligence gathering purposes, for purposes potentially to help their terrorist activities, and doing it in a more sophisticated way. So go back to 2017, Hamas launched a campaign targeting Israeli soldiers. They created fake online dating profiles to draw Israeli soldiers in. They then encouraged those soldiers to download a fake video chat app that was essentially malware. So they loaded malware on the Israeli soldiers' phones. That then enabled Hamas to extract data from their mobile phones and also potentially to geolocate them, which clearly is a very valuable capability if you want to attack somebody. 2018, there was more evidence of these sorts of attacks. And then ultimately, in 2019, the Israeli Defense Forces actually launched a kinetic strike on the building that they believed held the Hamas cyber team. So clearly, they thought, there was something here that needed dealing with. But interestingly, as of this February, according to the Israelis, Hamas are back to doing these kinds of intelligence gathering operations. So it's an interesting example of a terrorist organization that is using cyber in a more sophisticated way. It's using it to put malware onto a target's phones. And we need to keep a close eye on that and to see whether this will lead over time to a progress further up the chain, if you like, in sophistication, which could potentially lead them into more disruptive territory. I guess the final thing to think about in this context then is the role of the nation state. And hostile nation states, so Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, are very, very active exponents of cyber operations of all kinds. So espionage, yes, propaganda, clearly, but also for disruptive and destructive purposes. And we are seeing increasing examples of this, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A perhaps. And also during the pandemic, we've seen quite a lot of cyber activity. So I think where perhaps the greatest risk arises is if you were to see hostile nation state, and Iran being a pretty good example, connecting with a terrorist group and actually providing enabling and support to enable that group to carry out destructive cyber operations. And I think that were we to get into that kind of territory, and we've seen the Iranians as long-standing exponents of cyber attack for disruptive purposes. So were we to get into that sort of territory, then that could be a game changer in terms of terrorist cyber attacks, something that we're not seeing much evidence of at the moment, but it certainly could change quite rapidly with that sort of state support. So I think I'll leave it there, Ed, and we can hopefully pick up some of this in the questions.
Great, thank you, Conrad, and for putting your views across on that. I've got a series of questions here already, and for those who are online, please do send me your questions so we can have a good interactive discussion. But if I can kick off first by a written answer I've had in written question, is for Eden on the right wing side. It's saying that in the US, many now see the right wing terrorism as a greater threat than Islamist extremism. Do you think this is accurate? And do you think there's a realistic possibility of this becoming the case in the United Kingdom?
Thanks, Ed. I think there's certainly a compelling argument for it. Again, I would sort of refer you to the sort of ongoing discussion about what actually constitutes right-wing terrorism. And this is particularly complex in the American context, where you have a legacy of, I suppose, religious extremist violence directed towards abortion clinics, etc., as well as sort of distinct vein of anti-government violence, which often overlaps with far-right ideologies as we understand them on this side of the Atlantic, but very often doesn't. But regardless of that, politically motivated violence, often associated with right-wing views, is very commonplace in the United States when compared with other forms of violence, particularly Islamist extremism. The US government has obviously poured enormous resources into...
Looks as though you're freezing out a bit there, Eden. I'll let you come back on. So I'll switch over to... So you're freezing out there a bit, Eden. Apologies, everyone. Conrad, I'll come on to you. I mean, this is obviously very appetite, whether there's some cyber interference. You mentioned that most terrorist groups don't yet have the capabilities to undertake destructive cyber attacks. What would be the trigger for them to make this step change?
Sure. Well, as I said just now, I think probably the biggest trigger would be state support and state sponsorship. And if we just hover on Iran a bit more detail for the moment, because obviously they're a nation that has a long history of state sponsorship of terrorism. Iran's also was one of the earliest nation states really to adopt and use cyber attack for disruptive purposes. So one think back to the attacks in 2012 on Saudi Aramco, which destroyed around 30,000 computers, the so-called Shamoon virus, attributed to Iran. There was another attack around the same sort of time on Razgas, the Qatari gas company, also attributed to Iran. So really going quite a long way back, the Iranians were doing this. And I think I remember at the time, you know, it seemed quite striking that in some ways Iran was innovating and leading the way in using cyber for destructive purposes. And then just this year, we've had what appears to be another example of an Iranian attempted destructive cyber attack, this time targeting Israel, where it would appear, although we can't be 100% certain, but there's a lot of reporting that attributes an attack to Iran, an attack on an Israeli water treatment plant, an attempt to use cyber to disrupt the functionality of this water treatment plant. Now, in the event that attack was unsuccessful, but it is evidence of, it would seem to be evidence of continuing Iranian aspirations in this arena. So you put that together with terrorism, that could be a change. I mean, the Russians as well, obviously also have a track record of some destructive cyber attacks, most notably the attack on the Ukrainian power supply in 2015, which disrupted the access to energy by 250,000 people for several hours. So that state thing is one key thing. I think other things to look for would be insider threats. So we all know in cyber, insider threat is a major issue. It's a potential major attack vector, just as it is for fraud and other things. And we know that, for example, some years ago, there was an AQ sympathizer, an IT expert at Heathrow, who was subsequently prosecuted for his actions. Ironically, at the time, the conversations around that, I think, were more about that person using their access to put a bomb on a plane. But nonetheless, the idea that AQ had an IT operative within Heathrow Airport is pretty disconcerting. And so the potential of them having an insider in the right place at the right time, that could significantly increase the ability to launch some sort of attack. Other things you might see, I suppose, you know, if it becomes just a better option, if physical attacks become more difficult for whatever reason, or if they simply become less impactful, or fundamentally if it becomes an easier option. Now, it could be easier because of an insider opportunity, or, you know, we also need to be cognizant of the growing availability of malware as a service, malware, you know, available to purchase on the dark web. You have companies like NSO Group increasingly developing malware capabilities that previously really would have been the preserve of nation states and selling them, you know, arguably to the highest bidder. You've had examples of the unauthorized disclosure, alleged unauthorized disclosure of malware capabilities from Western agencies that have got out into the wild. So, and I think that's going to increase. Certainly the commercial availability of malware and potentially attack capabilities, that's just going to increase. And it's quite hard to police, and it's quite a hard issue for Western governments to deal with. So I think that could become another trigger. So nation state support, the opportunity becomes available, particularly through an insider, perhaps increasing availability of malware attack tools becoming increasingly easy to use. I think those are examples of the kind of things that could make a difference here.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, Conrad. My understanding that could all happen quite quickly, this step change. Just going back to the far right question from one of our customers here, it's saying, does far right terrorism seem more operationally devolved, either lone actor attacks, or is this just more indicative of what we're seeing on the wider terrorism trends? And that's really obvious for you, Eden.
I think it's a very good question. First of all, can you hear me all right, Ed?
Yep.
Is that better? Good. I think the answer to that question is yes and yes. On the one hand, the far right has, at least for the past 30 years, effectively pioneered the concept of leaderless resistance. So whereas with Islamist extremism and other forms of terrorism, I suppose hierarchical organizations of some form, shape or form are, if not the norm, then commonplace. Now, you don't really see that to the same extent within right-wing terrorism, where you're dealing with a much more amorphous collection of individuals who will congregate around certain issues in certain areas as part of certain groups. But in terms of actual attack planning, that tends to be overwhelmingly done by lone actors, and particularly successful attacks. I think is product of sort of operational security and digital age are very much prosecuted by lone actors these days, at least on the far right. However, I think there's a very valid point in your question that terrorism at large is heading in this direction. We've seen this with attacks associated with Daesh, with the Islamic State, and that move from seeing sort of coordinated attacks by Daesh Central to a much more diffuse violence by supporters. So I think, I was talking about the sort of the emergence of online communities, that plays a key role in facilitating lone actors. And that's a dynamic we see both with the far right and with Islamist extremism. The difference is that in the far right, there aren't any sort of headline organizations like AQ, like Daesh, which provide a sort of overall framework or ideological sort of guidance to their adherents. The far right is much more grassroots and bottom up.
Great, thanks, Ian. Just back to you, Conrad. There's a sort of insurance-related question here, but I think it's really from a threat perspective here. So I'll ask whether, as an insurer, should the focus still be on the large and complex risks, as the risk to SMEs is still very low? So I think he's saying, should big companies be more concerned than SMEs?
So I think everyone needs to be concerned. I think that large companies obviously definitely need to be concerned, and the key thing is also don't just be concerned and think in terms of, well, who might want to come after you specifically. There's a huge risk about just being caught up in global cyber incidents. So the two big events of 2017, WannaCry and NotPetya, companies like Maersk, organizations like the NHS, on the face of it, they weren't the direct targets of those attacks. They were caught up in attacks that got out of control that cost them very significantly in terms of disruption and business interruption and so on. So I think, large companies need to be thinking about that broad risk as well as the specific risk of criminals or others targeting them. I think SMEs are extremely important because, in many ways, SMEs are the most vulnerable to that kind of situation, or they're the most vulnerable to a ransomware attack because they won't necessarily have invested much time or effort into protecting themselves. They might see it as a very, very low threat, but equally, because of the nature of their operations, they might have much less capacity to absorb the consequences of, say, a ransomware attack or some other cyber attack that disrupts their ability to operate. Paul Ree has put out some guidance for SMEs on cybersecurity, on steps that SMEs should take to protect themselves on cyber. And I think they are, a really important sector to focus on, along with the sort of the big players.
Just very quickly, and I'll ask Conrad first, and then Eden come back. You touched on mitigation there, measures, Conrad. Just what are the sort of top 2 or 3 things would be your advice to anyone listening, whether you're an SME or a large organization? How do we mitigate against, I know they're generic, we're talking generic cyber here, but the methodologies are all the same. So whether you're going to be infiltrated by a terrorist organization, state or non-state. So what were your quick top 3 tips?
Yeah, so I think you've always got to think about people, process and technology. So think about people, your people. We often say people are the biggest risk in cyber. I think we should flip that on our head and say our people can be our most important line of defense. I think over 60% of breaches are spotted by members of staff, not by, antivirus technology. So invest in people, train them, educate them, make sure they understand what the procedures are, make sure you've got processes and procedures in place, and actually use them as part of your line of defense. I think getting your underpinning IT infrastructure right is critical. A lot of companies that are focusing hard on this are looking at things like their IT asset management controls, obviously basics like getting the patch management working right. But a lot of that is about the underpinning architecture of your company and just having that working properly. And then I think the third thing I would just talk about, if you want three, is supply chain. So increasingly, we're seeing cyber attacks using the supply chain as a way of getting to the main target, but we're still not taking supply chain seriously enough. So the government cyber breaches survey, which is a really interesting survey they do every year, that showed this year that only 34% of financial institutions had reviewed their immediate supply chain from a cyber risk point of view, and only 18% had reviewed their wider supply chain. So I think there's a big issue around getting a grip on the vulnerabilities that our supply chain is carrying and what that means for us in terms of risk.
Right, really interesting. A very helpful sort of top tips there. And coming back to you, Eden, on the same, are there any specific mitigation measures businesses and employers should take in terms of a threat specific to extreme right-wing terrorism, or is it the same advice you'd give to any form of terrorism?
Yes, I think those sort of risk mitigation measures are generally fundamentally agnostic, or sort of threat actor agnostic. And actually, one looks at the tactics being employed by far-right actors, they're very similar to those employed by these most extremist actors very often. So, generic mitigation measures will address or help address the threat posed by both. I would echo Conrad's comments about people, processes, and technology. I think regardless of which sort of vector the attack is coming from, staff need to be alert, or employees need to be alert to the possibility that an attack could affect their place of work, and they should know how to respond if that does occur. Processes, I think, in that context refers both to training employees appropriately, but also having recovery plans, business continuity plans. Can the business survive a terrorist attack? For instance, if premises are closed or damaged, how is it going to get back on its feet? How does business deal with potential loss of key personnel? And on the technology side, there are physical risk mitigation measures, which will depend obviously on the nature of the organization. For very large businesses with premises in, say, the square mile, you can go down the route of sort of blast resistant design and things like that. For public spaces, it might be bollards to stop hostile vehicles. And for SMEs, it could be as simple as having CCTV and shutters to act both as a deterrent and a physical security measure in the event of an attack.
Okay, thanks. And I'm just sort of going to bundle a couple of questions together here. This really relates to COVID, and one is really for you, Conrad. Do you think there's an increase in threat in the cyber domain caused by COVID, whether that's hostile states or other nefarious actors? And the same for you, Eden. What we're seeing is as we come out of lockdown, some of these restrictions being lifted. Do you see that going to see an increase in the likelihood of terrorist attacks? So first off with you, Conrad, should we be concerned about cyber and COVID, and then Eden, terrorism and COVID consequences?
Okay, thanks, Ed. So, there's quite a lot of material out there that suggests there's been an increase in cyber activity, hostile cyber activity during the pandemic, though depends what you count. It's quite hard to work through. But for example, Beazley have reported a 25% increase in ransomware Q1 this year as opposed to Q4 last year. So 25% more ransomware. Cyber company Carbon Black has said that attacks on financial institutions were up by a factor of 9 from February to April this year. So, that seems pretty indicative. And certainly there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's been a spike in ransomware. The kind of things we need to think about in the context of cyber and the pandemic, obviously the rush to home working technology. So we need to think very hard about the security of our remote working infrastructure. The criminals are going to be attacking that. So you need to be focusing on, multi-factor authentication, strong passwords. You need to have a grip on access controls. So who's got access to what systems? on things like shadow IT. You know, are people now just using their personal IT for business purposes more than before? What risks does that create? And I think in all of this, probably quite a few security waivers will have been given in the heat of the moment. So what kind of risk has been accrued as a result of that? We need to keep a close grip on that. People, and we talked about the insider threat. I think that threat has increased. People are home working. They're feeling vulnerable. They're feeling worried. They're disassociated from their teams. It's harder to keep an eye on them, so they're potentially more vulnerable. And of course, some companies, you've got a bit of turbulence in the workforce, people leaving. That can create issues. And it also means you need to have a real grip on your kind of joiners, leavers processes, your processes to take people's accesses away when they leave the organization. And the final thing I would say that we need to watch out for is kind of organizational focus. You know, companies have got a lot of things to worry about now in the pandemic. There's a risk that cyber drops down the list. There's a risk of a sense of companies feeling, well, we've done cyber, so let's worry about all these other things. There's a risk of reduced investment potentially in technology and in security. And I think the flip side of that is that we're all going to be pushing harder to get our new digital offerings out, to get that commercial advantage as quickly as we can. And obviously getting the security of those apps and other services right is one of the most difficult things. And there's the risk that cyber gets kind of pushed down the stack because it's perceived as a dragging anchor. So I think those pressures are things that we really need to keep an eye on if we're going to keep cyber secure at this, you know, extraordinary time.
Great. Thanks, Conrad. And Eden, what about, you know, the consequences of coming out of lockdown on terrorist methodologies and frequency?
I think COVID has affected terrorism, at least in the UK. I mean, we can sort of look at the short-term effects and the potential longer-term effects. In the short term, I think there is understandable concern about sort of conspiracy theories related to the pandemic and indeed its response affecting targeting. So we've seen increase in hate crimes directed against people of Asian ethnicity, being perceived, you know, as a result of their perception that they're ostensibly responsible for introducing the virus into the West. And parallel to that, we've seen attacks on 5G infrastructure. Now, neither of these have yet been classified as terrorist incidents, but it is nonetheless noteworthy the way that it has sort of galvanized antipathy and indeed violence towards a sort of novel target set. The other short-term factor, I think, is that there's pretty much a consensus that radicalization activity has increased, at least online, with people being locked down in front of their screens. Conrad made the point that sort of many people are sort of more vulnerable to potentially getting drawn into extremism because they're at home, they are alone, and you know there are the attendant mental health impacts of that. Whether that means that we're going to see a spike as lockdown measures are released, I'm less convinced. I think that the impact of radicalization will continue to be felt in the coming years. I don't think there's an immediacy between people in aggregate consuming sort of more extremist propaganda and a spike in actual attack planning. I think the effects of that will be delayed. But certainly, we might see elevated frequency in levels of attack planning over the next few years as I suppose those radicalized during the lockdown period sort of mature as terrorists, for want of a better word. In terms of the long-term impacts of COVID, I think in the UK, we shall have to see what the economic recovery from the pandemic response measures look like, but certainly uncertainty around employment and future prospects could drive extremism over the medium and long term. And we also have to think about the resourcing of counter-terrorism efforts if there is a severe recession and government funding is cut across the board. We'd have to see whether CT funding specifically would be protected from that.
Great, thanks, Conrad. And I think, sorry, Eden, there's a sort of segue across. You mentioned 5G, and just a quick answer, Eden, Conrad, as we're getting to the end. There's a couple of people have asked of what your thoughts might be on the Huawei decision.
So I think that the original position that we came to in January, the NCSC came to around managing the risk from Huawei was a good decision. And Huawei was going to have a relatively small role in the 5G network. It was going to be kept out of the most sensitive areas. And I think that was an entirely manageable risk. Things clearly have changed. And the thing that's changed are these American sanctions, which have really tightened up, which have meant that Huawei can't really access semiconductors anymore. So they are, in effect, no longer, the judgment is they are no longer a reliable supplier. They simply can't supply the kit that we would need. And Huawei haven't really been able to come up with a good answer to that. So I think that game has changed. And I mean, I think it was pretty clear that the American government was going to get Huawei one way or the other. But I think that, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And the question about how we handle the presence of Chinese technology and how we manage that risk in our supply chain is a very, very significant one. And, my view is the realistic solution is not simply going to be to ban it. And I think it's really important to take a measured risk management approach to this. There's no such thing as a trusted 5G vendor. All 5G vendors can be got at, they can be hacked. Arguably the most significant attacks on our own telecommunications infrastructure have come from the Russians, who are not a major supplier of telecoms infrastructure. So, if we think that by kicking Huawei out, we've somehow now guaranteed a sort of secure 5G infrastructure, then, I think, we need to think again. And for government, we need to think much more broadly about how we manage the risk in a much bigger technology field in the future.
Okay, thanks. And I just need a 15-second answer from both as we come to the end. Do you think that terrorist use of cyber is a greater long-term threat? Do we think that it's going to be their current sort of off-the-shelf methodologies, the low technology? Eden, perhaps you first, or do you see the terrorists moving into another methodology?
I think whether terrorists will fully adopt sort of cyber as an attack technique, at least in the sort of foreseeable future, is pretty questionable. It doesn't have that immediacy and sort of visceral impact which most terrorists look for. That said, I think we can definitely envisage a scenario not too distant future where non-state actors acting in the cyber realm behave in a way which would justifiably be classed as terroristic.
Okay, comrades, just a 20-second answer. Should we be more worried about cyber, or should we be more worried about terrorism?
So I think in terms of terrorists, as Eden says, probably the greater risk is from their use of conventional attack methodologies. But we are seeing a growing normalization, I think, of destructive cyber attack. We've seen Iran and Israel take part in tit-for-tat destructive cyber attacks this year. So I think, we've got to keep a very close watch on how that develops and how terrorists potentially gain access to those capabilities in future.
Great. Well, that comes to the end of our webinar. And I said I'd finish promptly at 11:45. So first off, I'm very grateful to Conrad and Eden for taking up their time and research to answer the questions and brief you all very clearly on what the threats of the extreme right are and the cyber threat. There's been a whole host of questions of which we managed to get through some of them. We will answer all of these questions for you, and they'll be published on the website, as will the recording of this. So apologies for those we didn't get round to, especially some of those technical questions on the insurance matters, which may have taken longer to answer. So we'll get back to you with all those, both whether they're threat related or insurance related. We'll be holding our third webinar in September. We'll publish the date when we've got that, and we're going to look then at the threat of chemical, biological, and radiological use by terrorist organizations. So we very much hope that you'll be able to join us then. And in the interim, thank you again for your time, and I wish you a very good summer holidays.